Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Road to Recovery podcast. This podcast is a platform for education, discussion, and conversations on mental health. I'm your host, Amira Shah, and in this podcast, you'll get to know more about the therapeutic process, insight into life from the perspective of the psyche, and also join me in exploring current issues with other practitioners. I specialize in grief, but I'm always interested in learning about the human experience of the mind, heart, and spirit. So join me on this journey of in-depth learning about ourselves and the world we live in. Hello everyone, welcome back to Science of the Soul. Today I have with me Roisin Taylor. Roisin is a personal violence counselor who works with domestic violence and sexual abuse in a university setting. She supports students with issues around violence, and she used to work with DV Connect Australia. Roisin has been working in this space for about 4 years now, so I'm really excited to have a conversation with her. She has a lot to share, a lot of things that I don't really know about. So welcome, Roisin. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for having me, Amira. Yes, as Amira said, I've worked in this space now for 4 years, just working mainly with domestic family violence and sexual abuse. Right now I work with students that are affected by this issue, and I also not only just work in the counselling space, I also do a bit of prevention work as well. So that can look like running relationship workshops, educating people on what boundaries look like, what assertive communication is, red flags, learning a little bit more about perhaps the attachment styles and their personality types as well. Yeah.
So when you're talking about attachment styles, what exactly are you referring to?
Just in general, I guess, giving people a time for reflection on what they've grown up with, perhaps, what kind of dynamic they've seen growing up, and then what dynamics they recreate in their own relationships. So secure attachments, disorganized attachment styles, avoidant and anxious attachment styles. And yeah, just kind of creating a space for them to reflect on perhaps what behaviours they struggle with and where they fall with that.
So being familiar about their attachment styles and how that plays out in their adult relationships.
Yeah, and just, I guess, any kind of trauma as well that perhaps has brought about those particular attachment styles too.
So recently we talked off the record a little bit about sex workers and the trend that you have observed in the university setting about that, which is why you are also doing some of the prevention work that you are engaged in at the moment. Can you tell us a little bit about the trends that you've observed?
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's something that kind of surprised me as well a little bit. I think it's something that is a lot more common now these days, is a lot of women entering the sex work industry, and men as well, especially around online, OnlyFans or perhaps strip clubs, stripping, topless waitering jobs, any kind of sex work. And I do find a lot of students, just needing support, I guess, around how do I set my boundaries, how do I assertively work in this space and still be safe. It's also quite a common, unfortunately, thing that a lot of sex workers are more at risk of domestic violence or any form of violence, sexual abuse too. So just talking around expectations when they're walking into a certain situation, what boundaries, what perhaps safety plan they have in place as well to help keep them safe. Yeah.
So what are some of the boundaries or boundary setting expectations that's important, and why does that come into the picture so strongly for sex workers?
Yeah, I guess because the risk is so high, engaging in something like sex work, for the potential for things to get violent or for sexual abuse to happen, it's just important that they perhaps walk in with an expectation around what are my boundaries in this certain situation. It might be like, cash up front first. It might be not engaging in certain sexual acts that they're not a fan of. So it's just really outlining, helping them, empower them as well to make sure that they're walking into that situation as best equipped and prepared.
Okay, so maybe it might be worth to back up a little bit, and if I may ask, how do you define sex work in this sense? Because I'm a bit fuzzy around that. And you mentioned OnlyFans and topless bartending, was it? Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about what is defined by, or how you would define sex work?
Yeah, I feel like it's something that has even changed over, recent years in terms of exactly what is sex work. I think it's a lot of things. It can be, selling explicit images online, posting certain content, engaging in sexual acts or of some kind of inappropriate, perhaps, I don't know how you kind of would word it, but where you're showing parts of your body that's not as common, I guess, in other kind of careers. So it's just doing of work of that kind of nature, I guess. And I mean, in general, I think this type of work it's quite ancient too. It's like one of the oldest jobs that people did too. So it's just really evolved, I think, over the centuries.
So is it like aspects of sexuality being a currency?
Yeah, definitely. Anything kind of that nature.
And you mentioned that there's more risk for people involved in this sort of work to experience personal violence issues because of the lack of boundaries, or is it because of past traumas? What are the main root causes, or correlations even that you have experienced?
I think there's like many factors really. I think the most obvious one of just the nature of the work is that you're perhaps in a more vulnerable situation. You could be one-on-one with someone that's a lot bigger, stronger than you, in a sexual nature, where things like manipulation and all them kind of nasty behaviours can come to play as well. So it's you're more vulnerable in that aspect of exposing yourself in an environment that perhaps other people might not engage in. Again, of a sexual nature, of a private one-on-one nature.
And I wonder, when people are engaged in this sort of work, is it normally more of are they being cared for by an organization or an institution that they work with? Or when you mention OnlyFans, I don't know what the governing body or the safety guidelines are for people who engage on certain platforms. I know that, well, I don't know, but I imagine that in clubs or restaurants or bars, there might be some guidelines that outline what's okay, what's not okay for the patrons and for the workers. What about these online platforms?
Definitely. I mean, I can't, say for sure, but I'm pretty sure things like OnlyFans have guidelines in place to even prevent them distributing images and things like that. They have their own policy or perhaps their own consequences as well for those people that choose to do that. There's also eSafety is an online platform that often I guide my clients to, if basically even for things like revenge porn or explicit images and things like that being shared without their consent that you can go to, and they take the images down basically, and it's, you know, it might go as far as going towards the police as well, depending on what you want to do. But yeah, that's a platform I always advise people to go to.
Can you tell us a little bit about eSafety and what this platform offers?
I'll try and think, but it's just essentially a site that is just about, I guess, staying safe online and trying to hold people accountable as well for, you know, posting things that aren't within their right to post. I think again it's something that's like developed over the years as well, and trying to keep up with all these, you know, new ways of living, I guess. But yeah, just basically is a platform where you can get even information on how to stay safe online as well, again around like the boundary setting and expectations. I think it's important to empower people with their own kind of way of engaging with platforms if they want to do that kind of work. It's important that they feel safe in doing that. Yeah.
So eSafety is not specifically for sex workers. They are for anybody that have concerns around the safety of their sexuality and I guess explicit material that can endanger their reputation. So just out of curiosity, how did you fall into this space? Because it's very unique, and I kind of want to know a little bit about your professional history in terms of, you know, working in this area.
Yeah, I guess, you know, I started thinking I'd end up kind of in private practice. I think some like domestic violence and sexual abuse has always been something that I've felt quite strongly about. And yeah, just the whole like political side and injustice side of women not being able to, I don't know, freely express themselves, freely do as they please, and, you know, just have their basic human rights respected as well, I think. So that's why I fell into this kind of work. It's, I guess, I don't know, really rewarding as well. I feel quite aligned with my values in helping other women through these things. And I guess, you know, even aside from sex work, I think it's just like a little niche in which I've noticed in this kind of work that has become, you know, more of a common thing, especially amongst young women too, especially at the university kind of sector. It's definitely a growing space. I think I was reading research the other day that was saying something around like apparently like 10 to 40% of women in Melbourne brothels are university students. So, you know, there's a lot of big statistics out there, and I'm sure they're probably growing, and there isn't enough research currently that's keeping up with it. But it's a space that, like, I don't think there's enough support around helping women feel safe and supported. Yeah.
And you mentioned not only women, but also men are known to, some men are known to engage in sex work as well. Would they be typically from the university cohort?
I mean, that's a point as well. I think from the research that I've looked at, that has included men in that research as well. So they would be a part of it. In my personal experience, I can't say I've actually come across anybody in that industry. But I think, like we were saying in the past, you know, it's something I feel that my clients, when they feel safe, are comfortable to tell me that they're in that space of work, because, you know, there is so much still stigma in society around this kind of stuff. So I guess, you know, it's a bit of a privilege as well when people feel safe enough to talk about this stuff and to have them conversations. Again, you know, something that's quite taboo perhaps, but it's such an important thing to, you know, feel safe and supported with. And if you can't tell your therapist, who can you tell?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you talked to me a few weeks ago about that, the statistics that you shared. I mean, 10 to 40% is a large sort of, it's a big proportion from 10 to 40. Like 10% it means something, 40% means something else. So I'm wondering about that number. Why do you think it's 10 to 40%? Is it because it's kind of generalizing multiple Melbourne brothels or multiple universities?
I think that particular statistic was going off, multiple different brothels, but it's also, I think, just unclear. There's probably not able to conduct all the research as well on all the different places. But again, I think it's such a thing. They don't have enough statistics probably around, really. But again, something as a therapist you see popping up a lot more, and realizing, wow, this is a space that I need to educate myself on as well, so I can better equip the students that are coming to me with those issues too.
Yeah, funnily enough, and I think I shared it with you after we had our conversation a few weeks ago, I suddenly had a couple of clients coming in talking about this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's right. This is a thing. And I guess it never really struck me. And it's becoming more and more a reality, because ever since our conversation, even though it was only a few weeks ago, I'm going back in time and thinking about people I've met who are studying and also dancing. And naive me didn't really understand what that meant until a little bit later, and I started connecting the dots after speaking with you. And that's why, I thought, like, let's have this podcast. It'll be a really good idea. So what are some of the stigmas, you think, if you could break it down, and how is society changing in terms of their attitudes towards sex work?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's even on like a whole nother level when you look at like celebrities that engage in this kind of work. All you have to do is, look at the TV and see people like Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion. It's, I don't know, rappers of my generation anyway, but that openly talk about how they, went through stripping to be able to get where they are, or they engaged in sex work throughout their degrees as well. So it's become, I guess, a bit more normalized or talked about. It's always kind of been there, like I said before, one of possibly the oldest kind of professions out there. It's just that I guess less maybe shame is being around it, more people are talking about it, and it's also, it's not just, it used to, I think, be more of like a low socioeconomic thing, whereas now people are doing it to support, their university studies, or to live perhaps a more lavish lifestyle that they want. And yeah, so it's still a bit of a battle, I think. And I guess I'm just all for empowering women to do what they want to do in a safe way, and if that's through their sexuality, I don't, there's no fault in that.
Yeah. So like no judgment there. I just want you to be able to do what you think is best for you, but just do it safely. Mm-hmm. And we'll support you if, shit hits the fan. Yeah. That sort of thing. I wonder how this plays into, I guess you talked about it a little bit in terms of how they fall into violence accidentally or through attachment patterns. I wonder if you have any comments on the types of attachment patterns of people who engage in sex work. Is there like a higher prevalence of people who are securely attached or anxiously attached? Is that something you can even comment on? I do understand that research is really like thin in this space.
Yeah, I think that's like a really tough question, I guess. I think like from what I've heard, like somebody of a certain probably anxious attachment style wouldn't last very long in that industry, to be quite honest with you. Again, that's I think you have to learn to have very firm boundaries, learn to assertively communicate yourself, communicate to other people like what those boundaries are, what you will accept and what you won't. I guess so in my experience, to be honest, some of the people that last the longest years in it create very good assertive communication skills. I'm not too sure whether that would be secure or not. But yeah, I guess a lot of women that do fall into that work as well can have like trauma histories and perhaps sexual abuse histories and things like that as well. Again, I think it's just something that is with everyone. There's no pattern, I guess, that I can see.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the things that I'm most curious about is, what have you observed in your work in this space in terms of the mental health concerns or manifestations of people who are engaged in the sex industry? What are they being confronted with, or what do they bring in the therapist's office, and what do you observe in terms of the fight or flight responses, in terms of their hypervigilance, in terms of the mental and psychological and emotional energy that they need to do this kind of work? Because as I mentioned, I've had a couple of clients since we've spoken, and apart from being a full-time student or a part-time student who has other obligations, like maybe raising young children, everything is generally quite demanding of a person. And then you enter sex work and you have to be quite on guard in terms of your boundaries. You have to be vigilant, you have to be aware of dangers all the time, and you have to also kind of sell yourself. So you're working really hard to interact, to connect, to communicate with people in order to meet their needs, and that it is you who will have to meet their needs in very specific ways. So what is the mental toll or the psychological toll that takes upon them? Like, what do they go through? What do you see in your therapy room? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, like I think one thing that I kind of noticed a lot was a lot of younger women that find themselves in these industries, especially just starting up, struggle a lot with the whole boundary setting and people pleasing behavior, but then realizing that it unfortunately might lead to things like sexual abuse or other forms of violence, because other women that have been in the industry a bit longer are able to assert their boundaries a bit quicker, or they've unfortunately learnt through things like that happening. Yeah, I mean, it can be a range of things. Some people, I think, do dissociate in order to get through certain aspects of the work. I think it's just kind of maybe perhaps the end goal, or perhaps how they view what they do and how it meets their needs, that helps them through certain aspects of the work. Yeah, I think it's tricky to comment on like an overgeneralized view of it, because I think everyone's quite different. Some women are very avoidant attachment, so have that emotional off switch that they can do the work quite well. And other women, find it quite difficult and need to have them kind of firm boundaries so that they're not getting swept up in other situations that they don't want to be in.
So how do you, I guess, guide them towards self-care? Because I wonder if there are specific ways for them to fill their cups because of the special work that they do and the special skills that they need to have. And the fact that they probably have to always be vigilant, because otherwise, safety is an issue.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. And like you said before, I think hypervigilance is probably quite a common thing for a lot of sex workers. So I guess, yeah, finding that off switch would just be finding that safety. And again, I think you can find that safety even in being empowered within yourself to set your boundaries, to feel safe, to feel like you have a safety plan around you, going, if you're going to certain like people's houses and things like that, some people, might bring a friend or somebody with them so that they know they're not going to be alone. They've always got kind of like their out, how to get out, what to do. And just in terms of self-care, I guess just having space outside of that work to just still, explore who they are and still express themselves in their own ways. But a lot of that kind of grounding techniques, as I would with anybody who's experienced any form of like domestic family violence, sexual abuse. And I guess, a big thing to comment on as well is that I am a personal violence counsellor. So a lot of these students that I am seeing in sex work have some history with domestic family violence and sexual abuse. So perhaps I'm only seeing one part of that population too.
Yeah, that's that. There's a bias there, right? Because you're only exposed to a slice of them in that cohort. In terms of personal violence and that have been experienced by sex workers, can you comment, I guess, on any causality or correlation, and how good are they, or how easy is it for them to establish boundaries if they've been victims of violence in their younger years?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a lifelong battle for some people. It's tough. It's when you, I think, engaging in sex work, perhaps they might have already learned skills to dissociate from sex through having gone through things like sexual abuse in the past. And there is a thing called, re-victimization, in which they perhaps have experienced several personal violence incidents as well, which sometimes creates kind of a bit of a different view of the world, and falling into the industry feels almost a bit safe as well, or like something that they're used to perhaps being a part of. Yeah, it's just, again, trying to practice in the best way to how to empower them to still getting their needs met. And I think that's what sex work comes to at the end of the day, is, are they feeling that their needs are being met? And if so, then they're happy to kind of go through with whatever that might be. Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one.
Oh, no, thank you. Yeah, because there's so little research around this. It's also hard to comment. And I know I'm asking some like impossible questions. I'm just kind of hoping that the stuff out there that you are aware of. But I also acknowledge and understand that, research is limited just due to the nature of the work. You spoke a couple of times about dissociating or dissociation. Would you mind telling our audience a little bit about what that means, just for context?
Yeah, sure. So dissociation is kind of a thing that comes about usually from trauma. So it's just a way of kind of freezing up, not quite being there in the room, but being there. Like, I guess, like daydreaming or something might be a form of dissociation. I think there's several different forms of dissociation, but it's usually that kind of zoning out experience. And a lot of people might dissociate in situations to protect themselves, almost like a bit of a freeze response as well. I think there's links with dissociation and freeze responses too.
Yeah, when you say that, I think about how animals play dead. Yeah, to ensure survival. And as we know, dissociation happens with a lot of people with, who's experienced significant traumas in their life. And it can manifest in different ways, like self-harm. And I'm just wondering, do you notice that self-harm is a thing for clients that you see in the personal violence space first, and also specifically in sex work?
Yeah, I definitely think, self-harm is definitely something I do see in the domestic violence, sexual abuse space. I think a lot of it sometimes comes to like emotional regulation as well. So if you've grown up or you've been around people that it hasn't been a safe space to express your emotions, people sometimes internalize a lot of that, and self-harm as a way to regulate their emotions, as a way to take out anger or frustration out on themselves instead. And again, it pairs with a lot of them traits like self-blame and guilt that come from a lot of survivors of these type of issues. And then I guess sex work in particular, I've seen a few of my students as well that have done self-harm too as a way of coping. Again, like internalizing that pain, taking it out on themselves, not having an alternative way of having a healthy coping mechanism or having that modeled to them as well.
Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Science of the Soul. This is a short interruption to let you know that if you or someone you know are in need of more support, you can find me at Road to Recovery on my Facebook page, my Instagram, or my website at aroadtorecovery.org. I hope you've enjoyed listening so far, and now let's get back to the podcast. We also talked a little bit about power and control at the center of domestic violence. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how this kind of feeds into your work?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess at the center of all like violence related issue is the perpetrator's fascination and need for control and power over the other person. So a lot of the time I can kind of see that dynamic play out, or if you're confused as to who an abusive person is in a situation or in a dynamic, it's often the one that holds a lot of power and control over another person. And that can look like, there's a thing called the cycle of violence that we often talk about in this space, which is where it's actually like a cycle. It's not just a violent incident. It's often a dynamic where there's like a bit of tension building. There's like the explosion, verbal, sexual, physical abuse. Then there's that kind of like apologies, trying to subdue them, regaining control over them again, and then like love bombing as well. So lots of gifts and lovely words and things like that. And that's why people stay trapped in these cycles and trapped in these relationships as well. And it makes it a difficult space to get out of. But at the core of all of that is that need for control over the other person and that power.
Yeah, and I can imagine if you've been with somebody for a little while, so you're quite invested, maybe you've started a small family or you've got joint finances or whatever it is, or just maybe like a few years with this person, chances are we're less likely to cut our losses. We'll try to work things out, and I can see how the cycle of abuse can keep perpetuating over and over again. Okay, last chance, okay, second chance, okay, third chance, you can't do this to me again, and then it just repeats. Maybe the intensity of the love bombing is a lot bigger, or the apologies come faster, the remorse comes faster. And I do acknowledge the fact that perpetrators who are perpetuating this cycle are probably functioning from a subconscious or an unconscious level as well. So it's not like, I'm guessing most of them are not particularly viciously evil and doing this deliberately. It's like, I'm going to apologize so that she'll come back to me, or he'll come back to me, and then I'll like do all these things and then I'll do it again. Like, I don't think anyone has, well, not anyone, but I don't think many people have that sort of thought process, but it is a very subconscious or unconscious process that happens, and it's a cycle, and it just repeats. It's a pattern. So people tend to get stuck in that cycle, and then if they do break away eventually, chances of them getting into that similar familiar pattern, like, it just happens again, right? And yes, because you're being drawn to familiarity, and we've talked about that sort of thing in various different contexts in terms of relationships as well. Now, on the issue of violence as a gender-based issue, what are your thoughts? Because I do know that, yes, mostly women are the victims because we are the physically, biologically weaker sex than males. However, I also am aware that as of this year, Queensland Police recognizes domestic abuse reports from men as emotional and psychological abuse being, at least it's stated that is being taken into account seriously. What are your thoughts on this gendered issue? Or is it even gendered now?
I mean, from the space that I've been in for 4 years, we've always called it a gender-based issue, and the statistics show that women, on average are way more likely to be victims of domestic family violence and sexual abuse. Although it doesn't surprise me that there are more of these reports where men are the victims of psychological and emotional abuse, because I think, biologically, like you said, men are more likely to use physical abuse as a way of gaining control, as a way of displaying their anger, and financial control as well, definitely. I think as women, we don't display acts of aggression as much as men do, and therefore I think that seeps out in more passive aggressive ways, like emotional abuse, like manipulation, like things like that. So that's why I guess I can see that side too. But yeah, the nature I think is very different between men and women in these terms of how they exercise these forms of abuse. But like I said, if you really look at the dynamic, you have to often notice that it comes down to one person always needing that power and control over the other person. And I think, like you said before, nobody walks in and wants to do that. I think it's, there's a lot of issues at the basis of that perpetrator as well, a lot of insecurity, a lot of issues with feeling the need to be in control because they perhaps feel out of control and feel insecure. So needing that control over another person on a subconscious level. But yeah, there's so many, I think, dynamics within this, and it's such a complicated thing. There's so many forms of abuse. There's financial abuse, there's religious abuse, there's even reproductive abuse where people are, control perhaps people's birth control, or taking condoms off during sex and things like that, forcing people to have a baby when they don't want to, from both sides. So yeah, there's a lot in it, and often I think, so I was saying before, I do a lot of prevention work as well, and some of that is educating other members at the university on what abuse looks like, because there's just so many forms that sometimes when you actually lay them all out there, you realize, wow, this is going on everywhere on so many different levels. So it's good sometimes, I think, as well, for clients or for victims to be able to put a label and put language on what's happening to them, because it is, all the gaslighting, crazy making, all these things can make it really difficult to actually see what's going on around them, and that it is a form of abuse that they're experiencing.
I also recognize that isolating your partners, or maybe even your kids or your family, is one of the types of abuse as well, because the less connections you have, the less likely you are going to be leaving. So that is another form of control. But I'd never really even thought about reproductive abuse. I've come across it, that's for sure. But it did not strike my mind when we talked about having this conversation. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because I have encountered a couple of clients who have mentioned that, and we're talking about international students, so they're from specific like cultures and backgrounds, and how constantly being impregnated or being pregnant is just very exhausting. And I also have a friend who happened to be experiencing this, and it just spins me out, because we're talking about capable, intelligent, educated, accomplished women who are constantly pregnant against their will and trapped in this cycle of abuse, and not able, or this power and control cycle, and not able to escape it, because what are you going to do? Run away with 2 tiny kids and a pregnant belly? It's hard. And if you're in certain countries, that doesn't look very good. Australia, thank God, we're really blessed with all these services and so much awareness and education that we have. People like yourself doing this sort of work, which, to be honest, personally, I intentionally do not take on any domestic violence cases. It's because I've had a couple of experiences when I was working in the refugee space, and I was just like experiencing vicarious trauma from it, not knowing it at that time. So it was really intense, and I was like, nah, this is too close to home, man. I can't do this. I'm gonna leave it to other people who can handle this better. There's a lot of counter transference that comes up in me. And so I'm just like, nah, this is not an area I can work in at this point in my life. Maybe in the future. So yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the other thing I want to comment on is religious abuse. And as you know, my dissertation is on spirituality and religion and bereavement. So while I'm not particularly focused on religious abuse, some of the cases, some of my participant stories did revolve around religious abuse, whether it was from professionals who had worked with clients or just the participants themselves telling me about what they've experienced. And as a result of that religious abuse and loss, the existential crisis that they experience, the disenfranchised grief, the complicated grief, and everything that comes out of that is just, it's intense. Like, they suffer a lot because religion was there for you to help make meaning of, the universe, the world, the way the world works, the way people are, your internal processes, and how you relate to the larger world and existence, and all that sort of stuff. And then when you lose somebody you love, that all kind of, gets put in the forefront: mortality, meaning, purpose, love, all that. And then if you've experienced religious abuse, that's super fractured. The carpet is like swept off from under your feet. And then you sink into quicksand. It's not only destabilizing, it's utter pain and chaos, and you're just swimming in a vortex. And that's at least the impression that I got from people who have experienced loss and had religious abuse in the past. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's so many insidious nature of the whole different types of levels of abuse. I think there's just so many, like you said, spiritual, religious abuse, and that could just be anything from like not allowing someone to practice their spiritual beliefs completely. It's the kind of, just completely indoctrinating someone's views, someone's perceptions of everything, having to have that whole level of control over it. And I think that's where as well that whole trauma bonding comes about too. So it's, as you're with somebody and you're going through all these things together, there's a whole chemical exchange as well that's going on. You're getting these huge dopamine rushes when you're being love bombed, and then you're getting absolutely flattened from any forms of abuse or the tension building and the hypervigilance. And
it's like a roller coaster.
Yeah, it's a huge roller coaster that you become addicted to as well. And there's a level of that you are trauma bonded to that person, which becomes so hard to break, that even after these relationships people leave, or them kind of the relationship breaks down, people find it really difficult to stay away from them, so they might fall back into that relationship. I think I remember one statistic when I started this work at 1-800-RESPECT was it takes a woman 9 times to leave their abuser, and that that just shows that whole cycle, the whole self-blame, guilt that people feel as a result of being gaslit, as a result of being psychologically manipulated and abused over years or over a period of time. It causes people to really, doubt themselves, fall back into that relationship for whatever it might be. And I think we were saying before, like a lot of the time I feel like I have a lot of students, and it might not be that I'm supporting them perhaps leave the relationship. It's always just about how do we create and empower you, and how do we find the things that you can control. And a lot of people become, like you said, isolated, financially trapped, because there's so many layers of this abuse. So sometimes it's undoing them layers slowly but surely, finding your own independence through finding your own finances, having a support network, reconnecting with old friends, with family, just slowly building that kind of courage up as well to leave. And that, I think, self-confidence in that person too, because a lot of the work I do is working on that self-esteem and that self-worth with people who've been in these situations, so that they can feel that confidence with themselves.
I'm just thinking about the earlier part of our conversation today, and you mentioned confidence. So I'm just wondering, my experience when I cross paths with people who work in the sex industry, whatever their role is, they always come off super confident. So when you just mentioned that, I'm just like, I don't think I've met anybody who presented as, having low self-esteem. Like, I'm talking about personal and professional. There's always this air of, I got my shit together. And I wonder now that you've mentioned that, how much of that is a facade and how much of that is reality.
Definitely, because there's the whole fake confidence or fake it till you make it. A lot of women will even tell me it's like a mask they put on going to work. It's a facade, it's like acting. They see it as they're putting themselves in a complete different role, different personality. It's not the person that they are. And other people genuinely perhaps do feel confident and secure in themselves and are happy doing that too.
Okay. So I guess that would be a protective factor or a coping mechanism that is an adaptive one, wouldn't it? Like to take it on as a role, as though you're acting. So you put on your mask or your makeup or whatever it is that you put on, you switch on that persona, and then out you go. And for some reason right now I'm thinking of Robin Williams. I don't know why. That's a really dark story, and may his soul rest in peace. Because I remember reading an article somewhere, and it was similar to what he was saying.
I think like a lot of celebrities and stuff as well have, just from personal, just having a look, but like people's interviews and stuff. I think like someone like Nicki Minaj, like I'm into a lot of these female rappers, but Nicki Minaj says something about that as well, how she's quite a shy, introverted person behind closed doors. What? But she puts on this mask and she acts like this person, and she has these different personas come out, and I think it's great. I love it.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. I'm gonna start taking a slightly different lens to assessing or understanding or maybe psychoanalyzing celebrities. Not that, I should be doing any of that, like non-judgmental and all that. But it's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I guess I'd like to ask you a couple of things before we wrap up, if that's all right. I want to ask you if you've got any tips or nuggets of wisdom to share with our listeners around how to support themselves if they are engaged in sex work or they've been exposed to personal violence, or for people who are supporting their friends and family members who are, experiencing violence or is working in this industry.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to support anyone, I think, who's experiencing violence is just to be there simply, without judgment, without trying to control. The last thing they need is control, just trying to instill and empower them in their own choices, in their own independence, not suffocating them or trying to make decisions for them. It's really important that we all kind of have that independence and feel empowered to make our own decisions. I say this a lot to students. I think it's very easy for us to get wrapped up on what we can't control and overthink on all these things we can't control. So I always say, what can you control? What's in your control? And always flip it back to that, and it goes for that in terms of boundary setting, in terms of sex work. What can I control in this dynamic? I think that's really where our power lies as well.
Zazu agrees. If anyone heard a cat, that is Zazu, and he tends to agree. Thank you for that, Roisin. Very simple, but effective. And I like that you said that they often don't have control. So to give them control in whatever the choices are and to empower them, even though you might think that, they might not be making the best decisions for themselves. There is more value in the fact that they are making those decisions for themselves. Yeah. And finally, what are some of the resources you can point our listeners to? Maybe some of the things that you've talked about, and of course I will include them in the description of the podcast, but if you can just share a couple, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned before, eSafety, 1-800-RESPECT in general as well. I think they have some great resources on their website for a lot of these things in terms of safety planning, what that might look like, red flags, kind of things to keep an eye out on, that whole cycle of abuse that I spoke about as well, and power and control and certain different behaviours and different types of abuse as well on that website. For Brisbane-based people, DV Connect as well is a great resource. And just trying to think of any others. But I think those are pretty good, and they have a lot of coverage on them too.
Awesome, thank you. I'll list all that down for our listeners. It's been very informative and enlightening to have this conversation with you. I've learned a lot having many conversations with you, and I'm really, really pleased that we can record a podcast and you can share your wisdom. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. Great. It's been great.
All right. Well, that's all from us. We'll just sign off for now. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.